So I want you to imagine just for a second, your last really frustrating argument.
Oh, man. I think we all have one of those locked and loaded.
Right. Like, the exact one I'm talking about. Maybe it was at the family dinner table during the holidays, or
Or a tense, high-stakes meeting at work.
exactly. Or even just one of those chaotic, spiraling threads online where you just literally cannot stop typing.
Yeah, the ones that keep you up at 2 in the morning.
Totally. I want you to close your eyes and, channel that specific visceral physical feeling.
Because it's rarely just a mental exercise, right? Your body, it completely takes over.
Oh, 100%.
Your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets shallow, you might feel like a flush of heat in your face or sweat on your palms.
And your vision literally narrows. You get tunnel vision.
You really do.
And in that moment, both sides are entirely talking past each other. Like you are no longer listening to a single word the other person is saying.
Not at all. You are simply scanning their sentences for weaknesses.
Right. You are mentally reloading your own ammunition, vibrating with impatience, just waiting for them to take a breath so you can unleash your counterattack.
Which is, honestly, a profound evolutionary mismatch.
How so?
Well, what you are describing is the exact physiological state of a prehistoric human encountering a predator in the wild.
Like a saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly. Your brain's amygdala has completely hijacked your nervous system. It has flooded your body with cortisol and adrenaline because it perceives a mortal threat.
But the threat isn't a tiger.
Right. It's just your coworker suggesting a different timeline for a project or your uncle expressing a different worldview.
Oh.
We're literally playing out life or death, fight or flight responses with words instead of physical weapons.
And it leaves us feeling completely hollow.
It really does.
I mean, even if you objectively win that argument, even if
Yeah.
you deploy the perfect rhetorical takedown and leave the other person speechless, you walk away feeling exhausted.
Yeah, you feel disconnected, alienated.
And let's be honest, the actual problem didn't get solved.
Never.
The other person didn't experience some magical change of heart, right? They just retreated to lick their wounds and resent you.
So true.
So this brings us to the core premise we're exploring today on this deep dive. What if that very concept, the deeply ingrained idea of winning an argument, is actually a fundamental glitch in the human operating system?
It really forces us to ask whether our entire default method for handling human disagreement is fundamentally broken.
Because if the goal of an argument is victory over another human being,
Then every conversation becomes a zero-sum battleground.
exactly. So today we are bringing a completely different framework to the table. We're doing a deep dive into a visionary source document called The Blueprint of a Peaceful World.
And it is a massive, highly ambitious text.
Oh, it's huge. It essentially attempts to map out how humanity can evolve past its own self-destructive habits.
Yeah, it covers everything from global governance to digital ecosystems.
Oh, we are ignoring almost all of that today.
We really are. We are putting blinders on to the macro-level societal reforms and focusing entirely on the micro level.
Psychology.
Exactly. The internal landscape.
Yes. We are zeroing in on one single densely packed section of this blueprint. It's called Item 40, the multifacetedness of truth.
Which the text also refers to as the Protocol of Anekantavada.
Right. And our entire mission for this deep dive is to isolate this one protocol and, translate it from heavy, abstract philosophy into a rugged, everyday mental toolkit.
Because we want to make it accessible. We want to talk about this as if you, the listener, have zero background in philosophy.
We are going to look at how this changes your personal view of the world.
And the reason focusing exclusively on Item 40 is so transformative is that it isn't a debate manual.
It's not about learning debate tricks.
No, it doesn't teach you how to be a more persuasive speaker. It demands a complete rewiring of how you perceive reality itself.
How you construct your own identity.
Right, and how you engage with literally everyone around you.
It is a roadmap for turning conflict from a threat into a shared discovery.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, before we turn into the actual mechanics of this protocol, we have to establish the one hard boundary the source text gives us.
The safety net.
Yes. It provides a non-negotiable safety net for this entire exploration, which it calls the ethical minimum.
And this is crucial because the protocol of radically open exploration only functions safely if there is a floor you cannot fall through.
Right. So what is that floor?
The ethical minimum is the basic preservation, protection, and dignity of life.
So no negotiating on human rights.
Exactly. The text makes it explicitly clear. that you are under no obligation to entertain, validate, or explore the truth of viewpoints that advocate for the degradation or destruction of human life.
Okay, so if someone is sitting across from you arguing that you or a group of people do not have the right to exist safely.
The protocol doesn't apply.
Right. The protocol of Anekantavada doesn't apply to that conversation. You don't sit down and politely debate the merits of someone else's humanity.
Never. The protocol requires a shared foundation. Both participants have to implicitly agree that life is sacred and must be elevated.
Okay, that makes total sense. Once that safety net is established, then the radical exploration of how to live that life begins.
And that exploration begins with an incredibly jarring internal demand.
Oh, he really is jarring.
The source text states that before you can change how you interact with others, you have to fundamentally change your relationship with your own brain.
The document anchors this with a single foundational statement. It says, I admit that I see only part of the truth.
I admit that I see only part of the truth.
It sounds so simple. You hear that and think, sure, nobody knows everything. That's a cliche.
Oh yeah, it sounds great on a bumper sticker.
Right. But when you actually force yourself to sit with the psychological reality of that statement, especially in the heat of a disagreement,
it is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable.
The human ego absolutely despises that sentence.
It despises it because the human brain is fundamentally an inference engine. It's a prediction machine that runs on certainty.
Let's look at the underlying neuroscience for a second, because I find this fascinating.
Yeah, let's unpack it.
The brain consumes about 20% of the body's energy, despite being this tiny fraction of its weight.
It's an energy hog.
Totally. Processing new, conflicting, or ambiguous information requires massive amounts of metabolic energy.
But certainty, on the other hand, is cheap.
It's energy efficient.
Exactly. When you are certain about how the world works, your brain can just run on autopilot. It doesn't have to burn calories evaluating every new piece of data.
So we have literally evolved to crave certainty like a drug.
We really have.
Yeah.
When we feel we have the complete picture of a situation, our brain rewards us with feel-good chemicals.
But when we are forced to admit that our picture is incomplete, fragmented, or, God forbid, potentially wrong,
it triggers an alarm bell.
It's physical pain.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance actually lights up the same pain centers in the brain as a physical injury.
That is wild. I found a metaphor while reading through this section that really crystallized this for me.
Oh, I love a good metaphor. Let's hear it.
Okay, so I want you to imagine you are walking through a massive, sprawling, pitch black museum.
Okay, totally dark.
It's completely dark, and the only thing you have is a tiny, weak little pen light.
Just a narrow beam of illumination.
Right. Now you're walking through the dark, and your beam of light hits something. Let's say it hits a beautiful marble statue.
Okay, I can see it.
Within that tiny circle of light, the reality of that statue is undeniable. You can see the texture of the carved stone, you can see the curves, you can see the dust settling on it.
It is entirely 100% true to your lived experience.
Exactly. And if someone were to tell you the statue wasn't there, you would fight them fiercely because you have direct empirical evidence of its existence right in front of your eyes.
You're literally looking right at it.
But here's the cognitive trap. Because your flashlight is only pointing at that one statue, the rest of the colossal museum is invisible to you.
And this is where the brain gets lazy.
Right. The trap is that your energy-saving, certainty-craving brain automatically assumes that whatever is outside the beam of your flashlight simply doesn't exist.
It assumes the darkness is empty.
Yes. It equates the limit of its vision with the limit of reality.
Which is such a dangerous assumption.
The museum is filled with, vast staircases, modern art installations, ancient tapestries, and sprawling exhibits. But your brain tricks you into believing that the entire universe consists solely of a marble statue.
And worse, it convinces you that anyone who comes along and says, hey, there's a giant tapestry over here, must be delusional, malicious, or just plain stupid.
Because you can't see it.
Right. That analogy perfectly illustrates the first core concept of item 40, which the text calls epistemic modesty.
Let's break down epistemic modesty, because epistemic is one of those dense philosophical words, but the application is incredibly grounded.
Yeah, we can demystify that. Epistemology is simply the study of knowledge, how we know what we claim to know. Epistemic modesty, therefore, is the active, conscious realization of the strict, unyielding limits of your own perception.
It's the intellectual humility to accept that no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how many books you have read or degrees you hold,
Your neurological hardware is only capable of capturing a microscopic fraction of the available data in the universe.
It's the realization that your flashlight is permanently small.
Even if you consider yourself a true expert, someone who has studied a field for decades.
Right, maybe your flashlight is more of a spotlight.
Sure, a spotlight. But a spotlight in the Louvre still leaves 99% of the building in total darkness.
And this creates a profound shift in how we handle disagreement.
It changes everything.
Because without epistemic modesty, a disagreement is a battle between right and wrong.
Let's use the classic parable of the blind man and the elephant, which is heavily resonant with the Anekantavada Protocol.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right, so one person is touching the trunk and says, reality is a thick snake. The other is touching the leg and says, reality is a tree trunk.
And if they lack epistemic modesty, they will literally go to war over this.
Because they both think they have the whole picture.
The person holding the trunk thinks the person holding the leg is a liar who is actively trying to subvert the truth.
But with epistemic modesty, the framing changes entirely.
So...
The person holding the trunk realizes, I only have access to a small patch of leathery skin. I am accurately describing what I feel, but I know there must be more.
Oh, wow. So when the other person says, I feel a tree trunk, the reaction isn't anger.
No, the reaction is intense curiosity.
Because you realize they have a piece of the puzzle you're missing, which flows perfectly into the companion concept. The source text introduces cognitive justice.
Yes, cognitive justice.
If epistemic modesty is the internal realization that my flashlight is small, cognitive justice seems to be the external behavior that follows.
That's the exact relationship. It's the action step.
So how does the text define it?
Cognitive justice is the deliberate, active recognition that other people's systems of knowledge, their cultural backgrounds, and their lived experiences hold profound value.
They hold actual pieces of reality that you are blind to.
Exactly.
So it isn't just about being polite. It isn't that condescending tolerance where you pat someone on the head and say, well, everyone is entitled to their own little opinion.
Far from it. Condescending tolerance still assumes you hold the ultimate truth, and you are just benevolently allowing others to exist in their error.
Right. You're wrong, but I'll let you speak.
Exactly. Cognitive justice destroys the hierarchy of knowledge.
It levels the playing field.
It is the raw realization that you actually need the other person's flashlight. You have a fundamental deficit in your understanding of the world.
And the only way to fill that deficit is to borrow the light of someone whose life has positioned them in a completely different part of the museum.
You literally cannot see the room without them.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there because my blood pressure is rising just thinking about living this way day to day.
It's a big shift, I know.
I want to push back on this purely from the standpoint of human endurance.
Okay, let's hear it.
I hear epistemic modesty and cognitive justice, and it sounds beautiful in a Zen philosophical way. But practically, it sounds exhausting.
Exhausting to always be doubting yourself.
Yes. If my default setting every morning has to be, I am probably missing most of reality, my views are incomplete, and I need to constantly doubt my own certainty, how do I ever get out of bed?
That is such a fair question.
How do I ever make a firm decision at work? How do I stand up for anything if I'm constantly paralyzed by the fear that I'm only seeing the elephant's trunk?
It's the most common and vital critique of this mindset. People fear that admitting partial ignorance leads to total moral relativism.
Right, a state where nothing means anything.
Exactly. A state where all opinions are equally valid and you lose the ability to take decisive action.
So you're saying it doesn't do that?
No, if you practice the protocol correctly, anchoring it to that ethical minimum we talked about, it does the exact opposite. It is actually the cure for exhaustion.
Okay, you have to explain how constantly admitting, I don't know, the whole picture is a cure for exhaustion. That sounds backwards.
Well, think about the immense psychological burden of believing you possess the complete truth.
It's a lot of pressure.
It is. When you believe your flashlight illuminates the entire universe, you become the sole defender of reality.
Oh, man, I feel that.
Every single dissenting opinion, every piece of contradictory data, every person who sees the world differently becomes a direct existential threat to the structural integrity of your worldview.
You have to be on constant guard.
Always. You have to actively crush or dismiss every counterargument just to maintain your equilibrium.
And that is what causes the sweaty palms and the racing heart. You are defending the entire museum.
Exactly. You are carrying the weight of a whole building.
Oh, wow. When you put it like that, defending the universe is exhausting.
But epistemic modesty relieves you of that burden. You don't have to defend the universe anymore.
You just have to defend your little patch of light.
You only have to report honestly on what is within your beam. You can act decisively based on your current knowledge.
So you can say, based on everything I can see right now, this is the best path forward.
Yes. You stand firmly by your experience. But you strip away the fragile arrogance that says, and therefore nothing else can possibly be true.
So it replaces the anxiety of defending my ego with the energy of curiosity.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
Honest listening stops being this performative courtesy I do while I wait for my turn to speak.
Right, you're not just waiting to reload.
It becomes an act of gathering intelligence.
The text specifically mandates this. It says, I honestly listen to the other.
And honest listening means listening without the immediate reflexive intent to rebut.
You are listening to map their part of the museum.
All right, so we've established the internal mindset. I accept my limits, I am comfortable in my limited beam of light, and I know I need the light from others.
That's the foundation.
But let's drag this out of the theoretical realm and into the messy, high-friction reality of human interaction.
Yes, let's get into the weeds.
Because it is one thing to sit alone in a quiet room feeling epistemically modest.
Much easier to do when you're by yourself.
Oh, definitely. It is an entirely different beast when you are sitting across from someone whose flashlight is pointed in a completely different direction and they are actively, aggressively disagreeing with you.
This is where the protocol moves from a philosophy to an active toolkit. This is the art of the constructive clash.
The constructive clash, I love that phrasing. The source text gives us two primary mechanisms for this clash: steel manning and adversarial collaboration.
Let's start with steel manning, because to understand the cure, we first need to diagnose the disease.
And the default mode of almost all modern public and private discourse is straw manning.
Straw manning is arguably the most destructive cognitive habit we have normalized in our society.
It really is everywhere. Can you define it for the listener?
Sure. Straw manning occurs when you take your opponent's argument, completely ignore the nuance, context, or strong points they are making, and instead construct a flimsy, absurd, exaggerated caricature of their position.
You literally build a fake straw man out of their ideas.
Exactly. You then eloquently attack this weak caricature, burn it to the ground, and declare a triumphant victory.
We see this constantly, especially in politics or online. Let's say I'm in a town hall meeting and I say, I think we should reallocate some of the municipal budget to fund community parks.
Okay, a reasonable point.
But then someone stands up and says, oh, so you want to bankrupt the city's emergency services and let crime run rampant in the streets just so we can have more swing sets?
That is a textbook straw man.
They didn't engage with my actual argument about budget reallocation at all.
Not even a little bit. They invented a cartoonishly evil ghost argument just so they could easily knock it down.
And we have to ask why we do this. Like, why is this our default setting?
We do it because the brain's reward systems are deeply tied to social dominance.
Wait, really?
Yeah. When you publicly crush a straw man, you get a massive hit of dopamine. The crowd on your side cheers. You feel powerful.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Social media algorithms are entirely built to financially monetize this exact dopamine loop.
Which is why the internet is basically a massive straw man factory.
But it's cognitive junk food. You get a quick rush, but the actual disagreement remains entirely untouched.
And the fallout is terrible. The person you strawmanned feels deeply alienated and misunderstood.
And they will likely retaliate with a straw man of their own.
It's a vicious cycle. Which brings us to the antidote demanded by item 40, steel manning.
So steel manning is the opposite.
Exactly. It is the rigorous, intentional practice of actively building up the other person's argument.
So you take their initial point, and before you are allowed to counter it,
you must try to formulate the absolute strongest, most charitable, most logically coherent version of their position possible.
The text implies you have to articulate their position so accurately that they look at you and say, yes, that is exactly what I mean. You actually explained it better than I did.
And this is the strict rule of the protocol. Until you have achieved that explicit confirmation from your opponent.
Until they literally agree that you get it.
Right. Until they agree that you fully grasp the absolute strongest version of their perspective, you have not earned the right to critique it.
Okay, my defensive instincts are flaring up again.
That's natural. Let's talk about it.
Let's play this out in a real-world scenario. Let's say I am engaged in a deeply contentious debate with someone whose views I find highly problematic.
Okay, not violating the ethical minimum, but still...
No, not violating the preservation of life, but fundamentally opposed to my core values.
Okay, I'm with you.
Doing their homework for them, actively expending my own mental energy to make their argument stronger, feels like madness.
It feels counterintuitive, yeah.
It feels like I'm sharpening a sword and handing it to my enemy right before a duel. Why on earth would I elevate an argument I want to defeat?
That reaction is completely understandable because you are still trapped in the metaphor of the duel.
How so?
You are still viewing the interaction as a zero-sum battle for dominance. Steel manning forces you to completely shatter that paradigm. Because the goal of the protocol is not victory over the other person.
That is the hardest pill to swallow. The goal is not to win.
If your ultimate goal is to find the functional, complex truth of a situation to better navigate reality, then destroying a weak, flimsy version of an argument achieves literally nothing.
It is pure theater.
Exactly. Think of it like engineering. If you want to know if a bridge is structurally sound, you don't test it by throwing a pebble at the weakest wooden plank and saying, look, it held up, I proved it safe.
No, you test a bridge by driving a fleet of heavily loaded trucks over its most critical stress points.
You want to know what it can withstand. Steel manning is the act of stress testing your own beliefs by forcing them to interact with the absolute strongest, most formidable version of the opposing view.
Oh, I see. So if your belief cannot withstand the steelman version of the counter-argument,
then your belief is flawed and needs to be updated.
And on the flip side, if you steelman their argument, you might discover that beneath their poor articulation or aggressive tone, there is a totally valid piece of the museum they are seeing.
They might be identifying a real risk or a real human need that you are entirely blind to.
And you can only integrate their truth if you uncover what it actually is.
Which seamlessly transitions into the physical and psychological geometry of how we argue.
The geometry of argument. I love this part. The text introduces the concept of adversarial collaboration.
Yes, adversarial collaboration.
It sounds like an oxymoron. How can you collaborate with an adversary?
Think about the physical posture of a standard debate. Two people are sitting face-to-face across a table.
Right, staring each other down.
Exactly. I and my ideas, you're your ideas, and the space between us is a battlefield. Every point I make is a projectile aimed at your identity.
That face-to-face geometry naturally breeds defensiveness.
Adversarial collaboration changes that geometry entirely. It asks both parties to physically or mentally sit side by side.
Side by side.
You remain adversaries in your viewpoints. You still deeply disagree, but you agree to collaborate on a shared mission.
Uncovering the truth of the problem in front of you.
Yes. So instead of looking at each other, we're both looking out at a third object, the issue itself.
Like sitting next to each other staring at a whiteboard.
Exactly. Let's say two scientists have fiercely competing hypotheses about why a certain ecosystem is failing.
In a traditional face-to-face debate, they would publish competing papers trying to destroy each other's careers.
But in an adversarial collaboration, they sit side by side and say, I think X is causing the collapse, you think Y is causing it. Let us jointly design a massive experiment. We will agree beforehand on what metrics will prove X and what metrics will prove Y, and we will run the test together.
So they use the extreme friction between their viewpoints, not as weapons to create heat, but as a dual-lens microscope to create light.
The psychological effect of this is staggering. When you sit side by side with an opponent and steelman their argument, you instantly deactivate their fight-or-flight response.
Because you signal to their amygdala, I am not a threat to your identity. I am a partner in your search for clarity.
The hostility evaporates, leaving only the rigorous pursuit of facts.
But this leads to a terrifying precipice.
It does.
Because if I sit side by side with you and I genuinely listen and I successfully steelman the absolute strongest version of your argument, there's a very high probability that I'm going to discover a flaw in my own thinking.
It is the inevitable outcome of the protocol.
I am going to realize I was wrong.
Yes.
And that brings us to the third massive section of our deep dive, the psychological mechanics of changing your mind.
Because realizing you are wrong is one thing.
But admitting it without your ego completely disintegrating is another.
Absolutely. The source text gives us a protocol for this called Bayesian updating.
The text issues this clear mandate. I practice Bayesian updating of beliefs. I change my mind when the facts change.
Bayesian updating.
Now, I know this originates from Bayesian statistics and probability theory in mathematics.
Yes, Thomas Bayes.
Right. But we are talking about psychology here. How does a mathematical theorem translate into an everyday emotional toolkit?
In layman's terms, Bayesian updating requires you to fundamentally alter how you encode beliefs in your brain.
Okay, walk me through that.
Most people treat their beliefs as absolute, binary certainties. A belief is either 100% true or 0% true.
Right. This economic policy is a total disaster, or this economic policy is flawless.
Exactly. When you hold a belief at 100% certainty, it becomes brittle.
It can't bend.
Right. So if a piece of evidence emerges showing that the economic policy actually had one positive outcome, that tiny piece of evidence feels like an existential threat to your 100% certainty.
Because if it's not 100%, your binary brain thinks it must be 0%.
So, to protect yourself, you either deny the evidence, scream at the person presenting it, or invent a bizarre conspiracy theory to explain it away.
The psychological term for that friction is cognitive dissonance, right?
Yes. The pain of holding two contradictory ideas. Bayesian updating smooths out that friction by treating beliefs not as binary certainties, but as sliding scales of probability.
So instead of saying, this policy is 100% flawless, a Bayesian thinker would say, based on my current flashlight beam and the data I have read, I am 80% confident this policy will work.
Precisely. You assign a probability. Now, what happens when that new negative piece of evidence arrives?
It's no longer an existential threat. I don't have to defend 100%. I just look at the data, weigh its validity, and say, okay, new facts. I will adjust my confidence dial down from 80% to 65%.
There is no crisis of identity.
Yep.
You don't have to throw away your entire worldview.
You are just refining the calibration of your map based on new topography.
That's perfectly said.
I want to introduce a modern analogy here because this concept of identity enmeshment is the core of why arguments get so nasty.
Okay, I'm listening.
I think we need to start treating our opinions less like permanent tattoos and more like apps on our smartphone.
The tattoo versus the app. Unpack that.
Well, think about the process of getting a tattoo. It is painful, it takes time, and once it is inked into your skin, it literally becomes a part of your physical identity.
You show it off. Your friends know you buy it.
Exactly. Now, imagine 5 years later, you realize the tattoo is actually a terrible design, or it represents something you no longer believe in.
Oh, that's a nightmare.
Getting rid of it isn't just admitting a mistake. It requires an agonizing, expensive scarring process of laser removal.
So what do most people do?
They succumb to the sunk cost fallacy. They keep the bad tattoo and convince themselves they still love it just to avoid the pain of removal.
And that is exactly how we treat our political, social, or philosophical opinions.
We tattoo them onto our foreheads.
We curate our friend groups based on them. We post them online so everyone associates us with that belief.
So when someone comes along with data proving that belief is flawed, it feels like they are pulling out a scalpel and trying to flay the skin off your face.
You fight back with everything you have, not because you care about the facts, but because you are protecting your skin.
But if your opinion is an app on your phone...
Exactly. If your opinion is an app, what happens when a software developer discovers a bug in the code?
Does the developer cry? Do they deny the bug exists? Do they attack the user who reported it?
No. They say, thanks for spotting that flaw.
They patch the code and they push a software update. The phone reboots and it functions better than it did yesterday.
It's a completely frictionless process.
We should be treating our minds the exact same way. When new facts drop during an adversarial collaboration, we shouldn't feel defensive.
We should just be downloading opinion version 2.0.
It's just a patch. It makes our mental hardware run smoother.
That analogy perfectly isolates the problem of the ego. But the critical question is the execution.
Right. How do we actually decouple our ego from our opinions?
Because let's be brutally honest. Looking someone in the eye, someone you were just intensely debating and saying out loud, you know what, I was wrong, feels like a humiliating public defeat.
It feels like losing status in the tribe. How do we rewire that?
You rewire it by consciously choosing to switch tribes.
What do you mean?
The source text frames Bayesian updating not just as a mathematical trick, but as a proactive identity shift.
You have to change how you see yourself.
Yes. You have to actively stop identifying as the person who is always right. That identity is a trap.
So what's the new identity?
You cultivate a new identity where you take deep personal pride in being the person who is incredibly agile at updating their beliefs.
You make the agility itself the point of pride.
Exactly. When you make that shift, the act of changing your mind transforms from a moment of humiliating defeat into a massive public flex of cognitive function.
Oh, I love that. A cognitive flex.
You are essentially signaling to the room, look at how robust and functional my mental software is.
Yeah.
I can process new, contradictory data, overcome my own ego, and update my worldview in real time.
Whereas you were still stuck defending a buggy version of reality from 3 years ago.
Exactly.
It really is a flex. It projects profound, quiet confidence to sit at a boardroom table and say, you know what? The data you just presented is incredibly strong. It highlights a flaw in my proposal.
I am updating my priors, and I agree with you.
It completely disarms the room. What is the other person going to do? Keep yelling at you for agreeing with their data.
It neutralizes the conflict instantly, and it honors the profound pledge of the protocol. I change my mind when the facts change.
It is a pledge of allegiance to reality itself, rather than a pledge of allegiance to your own fragile ego.
Which is incredibly liberating.
Okay, we have zoomed all the way in. We've looked at the microscopic internal humility of the flashlight epistemic modesty.
We've explored the external engagement of steel manning and the side-by-side geometry of adversarial collaboration.
And we've unpacked the internal psychological agility of the app update, Beacon updating.
Now, in the fourth and final section of our deep dive into item 40, we need to zoom all the way out.
We need to examine what happens when these microscopic changes scale up to the network level.
Right. What happens when it isn't just you operating this way? What happens when an entire community, a workplace, or even just a group of 5 friends adopts this mental operating system?
This brings us to the ultimate crowning goal of the protocol.
The text describes this optimal state using 2 crucial concepts: collective intelligence and consilience.
The source states, I practice collective intelligence. Truth is not the monopoly of one, but the result of a network.
This statement completely dismantles one of the most persistent myths in human history.
The myth of the lone genius.
Yes. We have this deeply romanticized narrative of this singular, enlightened figure standing alone on a mountaintop who has achieved total clarity.
And the rest of us just need to sit at their feet and absorb their perfect wisdom.
We project that myth everywhere.
The lone visionary tech CEO who descends from the boardroom with the perfect strategy to save the company.
The single charismatic politician who claims that they alone can fix a broken system.
But the source text rejects this entirely.
It argues that a single node, a single human brain, is biologically incapable of holding the entire truth of a complex system.
Because their flashlight is too small.
Exactly. It posits that in a highly complex world, truth is an emergent property.
Meaning it doesn't reside in any single individual.
Right. It only sparks into existence in the connections between individuals. It is the result of a network of people, each holding their tiny flashlight, respectfully and rigorously sharing their light.
Which brings us to the concept of consilience. When I first read this word in the text, I had to stop and look it up. It's not a word you hear in casual conversation.
It's a heavy word, but a beautiful one.
What does consilience mean in the context of this protocol?
It is arguably one of the most beautiful concepts in the history of science and philosophy. The word literally translates to the jumping together of knowledge.
The jumping together, I like that.
In practice, consilience is the magical, undeniable moment when entirely different fields of study, using completely different methodologies and starting from entirely different premises, independently converge on the exact same conclusion.
So it's like multiple independent compasses all suddenly pointing to the exact same magnetic north.
Precisely. Let me give you a classic example.
Please do.
Think about when evolutionary biology, which looks at genetics and survival, ancient spiritual philosophy, which looks at human suffering, and modern sociology, which looks at group dynamics.
Okay, 3 totally different flashlights.
Exactly. When all 3 independently arrive at the exact same conclusion, that human beings thrive most optimally in environments of deep empathy and cooperation.
That's consilience.
When all those independent flashlights illuminate the exact same spot in the museum, you have achieved consilience.
The source text states, I strive for consilience, the unity of knowledge from different disciplines and cultures.
But it's crucial to note that consilience is not about homogenization.
Right. It is not about forcing everyone to think the exact same way or erasing differences.
Far from it. Consilience actually requires radical diversity of thought to function.
Because if everyone has the exact same perspective, you don't have a network.
You just have an echo chamber.
This makes me think of a musical analogy.
Let's hear it.
If you put 50 people in a room and tell them all to play the exact same note on the exact same instrument at the exact same time...
You haven't created a symphony.
Right. You've just created a very loud dial tone. It's flat, it's monotonic.
Lacks depth.
Exactly. Consilience is an orchestra. The string section is doing something totally different from the brass section.
And the percussionists are operating on a completely different rhythmic structure than the woodwinds.
To an untrained ear standing in the middle of it, it might even sound like they are competing in their complexity.
It sounds like chaos.
But when they lock in together, governed by the shared underlying structure of the sheet music, much like our shared ethical minimum, the result is a symphony.
The friction, the differences, the wildly varying textures are what actually create the harmony.
And that profound harmony leads us to the final, culminating sentence of item 40.
The ultimate directive.
I seek not victory over the other, but a synthesis of truths that preserves and elevates life.
A synthesis of truths.
Yes, synthesis is the ultimate evolution beyond compromise.
That's a huge distinction. We often think of compromise as a victory.
But compromise is actually a state of mutual loss.
It really is. In a compromise between two opposing views, both sides hack away at their own arguments, give up things they care about, and meet in a lukewarm, miserable middle ground where nobody is truly satisfied.
It's a zero-sum game where the goal is to just mitigate damage.
But synthesis is entirely different.
How does synthesis work?
Synthesis says, let's use adversarial collaboration. Let's take the valid steelman core of your thesis A,
Okay.
and let's take the valid steelman core of my thesis B. We aren't going to water them down. We're going to combine them to engineer an entirely new, higher-level understanding, synthesis C.
And synthesis C is so comprehensive, it renders the original conflict completely obsolete.
Exactly. You transcend the argument.
Okay, let's ground this in a highly practical scenario so the listener can take this into their life immediately.
Good idea. Let's make it real.
Let's say they are sitting in a planning meeting at work tomorrow. 2 department heads are locking horns. The temperature is rising. The fight-or-flight response is kicking in.
The amygdala is firing.
Right. How does the listener step in and use this operating system to achieve synthesis?
The most immediate practical action you can take is to intervene and physically change the question being asked in the room.
Change the question.
Yes. When people are arguing, the unspoken question hovering over the table is, who is right?
Always.
You must replace that question. You step in and ask, what is the greater truth that incorporates both of our valid concerns?
Oh, wow. That completely deflates the tension. It changes the target.
It shifts the geometry from face-to-face to side-by-side.
Let's play this out. Let's say manager A is aggressively arguing, we need strict, unyielding deadlines, otherwise productivity will collapse.
And manager B is arguing just as aggressively, we need entirely flexible schedules, otherwise employee burnout will destroy the team.
If the goal is victory, one of those managers will lose and the company will suffer.
Right. If the goal is compromise, they do some sort of messy hybrid work schedule that neither of them actually likes.
But if the goal is synthesis...
You ask the new question. You say, Manager A, your flashlight sees the absolute necessity of productivity. That is valid. Manager B, your flashlight sees the absolute necessity of mental health. That is also valid.
Our new shared problem is figuring out a systemic workflow that guarantees both.
Exactly. How do we build a larger container that can safely hold both of these truths?
You are literally creating a new reality that didn't exist before the argument.
You are turning the friction of the clash into the energy needed to build a better system.
And returning to the foundational text, that new system, that synthesis always has a specific directional vector.
It must be a synthesis that preserves and elevates life.
It always anchors back to that non-negotiable ethical core.
The tools of debate, logic, and argumentation are no longer wielded as weapons of ego to dominate others.
They are transformed into architectural tools used to construct a reality that honors human dignity.
That is the whole point of item 40.
Okay, let's take a deep breath, because we have covered immense paradigm-shifting ground today.
We really have. It's a lot to process.
We took this one single node of the blueprint of a peaceful world, item 40, and unpacked an entire interconnected toolkit for living.
Let's weave this all together one last time so the listener can firmly install this operating system.
It begins entirely within your own mind, with epistemic modesty. The uncomfortable but necessary admission that your flashlight only illuminates a tiny fraction of the museum.
Which naturally leads to cognitive justice. The realization that because your light is small, you desperately need the light of others.
Especially those who see the world differently, just to navigate reality accurately.
And when you encounter friction with those different viewpoints, you don't retreat into the dopamine hit of strawmanning.
No, you engage in the constructive clash.
You steel man. You actively do your opponent's homework. You build their argument until it is so strong and coherent that it stress tests your own beliefs.
And you shift the geometry of the fight. You use adversarial collaboration, sitting side by side to attack the problem, rather than face to face to attack each other.
And when that stress test reveals a flaw in your own thinking, you rely on the psychological agility of Bayesian updating.
Treating your deep-seated opinions not as permanent, painful tattoos, but as software apps on a smartphone.
Decoupling your ego from the data so that when the facts change, you proudly download opinion version 2.0.
Admitting you were wrong transforms from a tribal defeat into a massive display of cognitive agility.
Finally, as this scales, you abandon the myth of the lone genius and embrace collective intelligence and consilience.
You stop playing a dial tone and start seeking the symphony. You realize that truth is a networked phenomenon.
And the ultimate objective of human interaction is never victory over the person across the table.
The goal is always a synthesis of truths that elevates everyone involved.
What is truly profound about this toolkit is that none of this is abstract philosophy meant to gather dust in a university library.
It really isn't. Applying even 10% of this protocol completely defangs the anxiety of existing in a complex world.
It turns every single disagreement you face, from the dinner table to the boardroom, from a terrifying threat to your identity, into a genuine, exciting opportunity for growth.
It actively engineers a mind where curiosity becomes a much faster, much stronger reflex than defensiveness.
Exactly.
So we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, a specific challenge for you to carry into your week.
Because the reality is the protocol will be tested.
Soon. You will find yourself in an argument soon. You will feel that familiar spike in your heart rate.
You will feel your palms get sweaty, your vision narrow.
And that overwhelming, primal, evolutionary urge to just destroy the other person's point will rise up in your chest.
When that biological response hits, the challenge is to catch the glitch in real time.
Yes. In that exact moment, when you feel the absolute blinding urge to win at all costs, I want you to hit pause.
Take 1 second.
Mentally step back from the battlefield and ask yourself this single penetrating question. What piece of the truth am I intentionally blinding myself to right now just so I can feel like I'm winning?
Because the ultimate victory was never about defeating your opponent.
The ultimate victory is having the courage to evolve alongside them. It's turning your flashlight toward theirs, combining the beams, and finally seeing the rest of the museum. Keep exploring.